The Florida Panthers and Toronto Maple Leafs are eking it out in the Atlantic Division, with the Tampa Bay Lightning not too far off in the distance, a vintage Sidney Crosby performance, and a whole lot more on today's edition of Locked on NHL.
You're Locked on NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day.
Everyone, and welcome to this Thursday edition of Locked on NHL. I am Nick Zararis, the host of Locked on Oilers. That's my good friend and my co-host Hunter Hodies, the co-host of Locked on Penguins. And we want to thank everyone who's making Locked on NHL their first listen of the day. Locked on NHL, a part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code Locked on NHL for $20 off your first purchase. So, on today's show, this is going to be very Atlantic Division heavy. We're going to start with the Florida Panthers. We'll move to the Leafs in the second segment. Then the final segment, Hunter's going to talk about how good Sidney Crosby is, even though he's in year 22 of the NHL. So at the outset, I want to frame this conversation around the Atlantic Division and the East at large as being a testament to just how weak the conference is overall. I think most of us are resigned to thinking Florida is the best team based on their track record over the last 2 years, even though the results aren't as impressive as they've been in recent years. But before we go to Armando and talk and get his thoughts on their win last night, it just kind of feels inevitable. Like at least last year, it was the Rangers in Florida. This year, it really just feels like Florida because nobody else is all that convinced. Like, even with Rantanen, I'm not that convinced about Carolina. The Devils are in a real rut right now where they can't seem to put two good games together in a row. It just feels like at large, this is Florida's conference to lose. Not even division, conference.
They are, I think, the best team in this conference. I think when you look at the East, to me, there's five legit good teams, Nick. You got the two teams in the Atlantic, Florida and Toronto. You then have in the Metro, Washington, Carolina, and New Jersey. Washington has been really good this year. And I'm curious to see how this translates into the playoffs. They just signed Logan Thomas into that big contract. I think they can give the Panthers a really good fight. But if both teams are fully healthy, Nick, I'm taking the Panthers to win that series. Carolina, this Rantanen move, it kind of reminds me of the Gensel move last year, but Rantanen is a better player than Gensel. He's everything that the Hurricanes have needed and more for quite a while. The trick will be, A, can this get them over the hump? And B, will they be able to extend him once the season is over? Because if they can extend him, this continues their window for quite a while. And I think with Carolina as well, I still need to see it, like in the playoffs. Like they had this good regular season success, but once the playoffs come around, you see these really good coaching staffs game plan for them, and they're able to shut them down. Does Mikko Rantanen change that? I think they have a chance to have that change because of how dynamic Rantanen is as a player. Great release, really good as a playmaker. But I still don't think Carolina is done either. I still think they're going to make one more big move before the deadline. New Jersey, I think part of that, though, Nick, is Markstrom's out. I think once he comes back, that's really going to fix a lot of things for the Devils. And then in the Atlantic, it's really just Florida and Toronto. The three teams behind them, Ottawa, Boston, Tampa Bay, they're fine, but I don't really think they're that good. I think when it's all said and done, if you were to ask me right now who comes out of the East this year at this moment, I would take the Panthers because I think when healthy, they are still the best team in this conference, though. It would be fun seeing them play a team like Washington in the conference final, Carolina, etc.
It's interesting because Florida lost Brandon Montour. They lost OEL. Yep. They went back to the bargain bin again. And it feels like that's probably the area of most pressing need. They probably need to go out and add another defenseman that can play in the top four in a pinch just because they feel a little light there. We're going to throw it to Armando of Locked on Panthers for his thoughts on their win last night.
The force was certainly with the Florida Panthers on Wednesday night. What is up, guys? Armando Velez here from the Locked on Florida Panthers podcast, here to quickly recap the Panthers' 3-0 win over the Los Angeles Kings from Sunrise on Star Wars night. Dmitry Kulikov played in his 1,000th game and got a secondary assist for the Panthers on Sam Bennett's goal just under 5 minutes in the game. Panthers played a mostly controlled game. It was a playoff-style game for the Panthers. Really contained the Los Angeles Kings for the most part. Went into the third period once again against the Kings, up 1-0, and the Panthers control play, got a power play goal 5 seconds into a 5-on-3 and shut it down from there. Sergei Bobrovsky with a 30-save shutout, Matthew Tkachuk with 3 points, and the second line for the Panthers was Mackie Samoskevich, Matthew Tkachuk, and Sam Bennett buzzing. We're going to break this all down on tomorrow's edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. Your team every day.
And I'll give Florida a lot of credit. And it's the hardest thing to do is to stay competitive once you've already won. Between the mental aspect of complacency starting to set in, they went to the Cup final 2 years ago and lost. They got back last year, which very infrequently we see a team go back to the Cup final the year after and win. The Penguins did it almost 15 years ago at this point. But prior to that, it had been a really long while. And they still feel very much within their window of contention. They do eventually probably need to start lining up a Bobrovsky replacement if they want to stay this caliber of contender. But you've got Tkachuk, you've got Barkov. Reinhart took a crumb less to stay. We'll see what they choose to do with Sam Bennett after this year, who's an unrestricted free agent in the summer. You still have Lundell, who they are very high on. And frankly, I'm still very high on, even though he's yet to really emerge as a top 6 contributor. It just feels like they've really set themselves up nicely. And this kind of feels like how you need to operate in today's NHL once you have the star player. And look, that's the hardest part, is getting the star players to build the team around. There are franchises who go 25 years without having a player as good as Alex Barkov or Matthew Tkachuk. To get them both on the same team at the same time, now for them, it's simply a matter of, okay, who do we put around them for the next half decade to keep rolling this as long as we can?
Yeah, you're fiddling with the margins of your roster, I think is the best way to describe it, Nick. You have the hard pieces already in place. You have these players locked up. Now, how are you surrounding them? What depth players are you putting around them to help you out, especially on nights where some of your top players don't have it? Like, there's going to be nights, especially in the playoffs, this happens every year, where some of your top guys don't have it. Like, they're being shut down. So you need your depth players to really step up when needed. And I'll be curious to see what Bill Zito does, because he's been pretty aggressive over these last couple of years around the trade deadline. I think he's going to be fairly aggressive this year too.
Agreed. And I was talking about this on the Locked On Oilers episode I did today, and the idea, sometimes it's not about taking the biggest swing at the deadline. It's about taking the right swing. And Florida last year, Tarasenko wasn't incredible for them, but he was a really good top 9 addition. Not a line driver at this point in his career, not as nearly as dynamic as he used to be, but a solid secondary scorer sometimes is all you need. And look, we always try and take lessons and extrapolate ideas out from who wins the Stanley Cup the year before. But it feels like that's becoming more and more prescient as we go on. It's not necessarily about getting the biggest name. It's about getting the right piece. You think about Vegas 2 years ago, going out and getting Ivan Barbashev, Colorado the year before, trading for Josh Manson, Tampa Bay trading for Barclay Goodrow and Blake Coleman, and David Savard the first time around. It matters when you can find exactly what your team needs. Because frankly, and I'll leave you guys with this before we move on to our next segment, I think if you don't have those big foundational pieces in place prior to the deadline, it's too hard for them to get acclimated and take the reins of a team when you only get, 12, 15 regular season games. And then the playoffs, when you're adding depth guys, that typically means you already have the star power in place and you just wanted to reinforce that. It's really hard. And Gensel was great with Carolina last year. Don't get me wrong. When they played him with Seth Jarvis and Sebastian Aho last year, that line was like 65% in all the metrics. That line was absolutely remarkable. It's just really hard to implement and integrate a star player in that short a period of time.
Well, with Rantanen, at least, he has Aho around him. So I think it's going to be a bit easier in that regard. And I still very much like that deal for Carolina. Again, he's the exact type of player that they've needed to potentially go on a deep run, Nick. Really good goal scorer, great playmaker, someone who can really take the top off of another team. I feel like Carolina, again, they've had some really good pieces. They've continued to have good pieces. I don't think they've had a player like this, though, that could potentially also be with them for the long haul. So, again, I don't even think they're done. I like also the Taylor Hall addition, someone that can be a depth scorer, on your third line, someone like a middle 6 player, something like that, if he's still on top of his game, at least at that level. But with Rantanen, I think that's why they made the move now and not the deadline, because you get more time with him to get him acclimated with your team before like the major stretch run where you're battling for seeding, seeing who you're going to play in the first round and all that. So I think I hear you, but I think making that type of move now is a lot better than like, in March where you only get a month as a potential rental before he potentially walks. But now you have at least one more month, and then you can also potentially start those contract talks as well.
It's always helpful. The sooner you get a guy in, the sooner you can start to implement them and help them find their footing. We're going to take our first break of today's show. When we come back, we're going to talk about the Panthers' chief competition in the Atlantic, the Toronto Maple Leafs, right after this. So be sure to stick around. Attending NFL playoff games is an unforgettable experience that brings fans together. Now, my football team has been putrid for a long time, so I haven't been to a playoff game in forever. Like the last time I went to a playoff game, I was in middle school. I'm turning 28 in a week. So it's been a while for me, but there's no better way to get tickets to games than through our friends over at Gametime. And now Gametime's new feature, Gametime Picks, makes getting tickets to events even easier. It filters out all the fluff to show you incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. If you want to get down to New Orleans and support the Birds or see the Chiefs go for the three-peat, check out Gametime with the super deal that is so impressive. It offers the best value for the event. The app's features like seat views before you buy and all-in pricing with no surprise fees at checkout make the experience smooth and reliable. Plus, the on-time ticket delivery and lowest price guarantee gave me peace of mind. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out with Hunter and I on this Thursday edition of Locked On NHL. And in the Atlantic, I think you and I think most critical observers of the NHL, we're all in the same boat with the Toronto Maple Leafs. We like the star players. We love Matthews, Marner, Nylander. Even John Tavares is having a nice season for them this year. The Chris Tanev addition has worked wonders. He's been really strong for them. The questions are still the same, though. Who is their best defenseman? And can you trust their goalie? Because frankly, I think at this stage of his career, and the Locked On Leafs guys are going to talk about it here in a second, I don't think Morgan Reilly is a one on a Stanley Cup caliber team anymore. I just don't. I don't think his impacts are strong enough. I don't think the two-way elements of his game are as impactful. You look at the number one D on the recent Cup winners, you would probably say Montour or Forsling was Florida's best defenseman, and those guys a lot more well-rounded than Morgan Reilly. Vegas 2 years ago, probably Pietrangelo, maybe Shea Theodore, definitely more well-rounded. Makar, obviously, are probably the best defenseman in the sport. Hedman, who has had one of the best careers of any player post 2000. You keep going on and on. Pietrangelo again, John Carlson, Letang once, and then the previous time before that. And then you get to Chicago and you get to Duncan Keith and LA and Doughty. And you're talking about a different caliber of player than what the Leafs have had. And don't get me wrong. I think Morgan Reilly is a really good player. He's had a really strong NHL career. I just don't think he's that guy on a Stanley Cup caliber team. I can't see a world where Morgan Reilly's playing 24, 25 minutes a night in a conference final.
Well, they're going to have no choice unless they go out there and try to get what number one defenseman is going to be available. Like the best defenseman that could be available at this deadline, Nick, and I'm not being biased or here.
Not Dumoulin, excuse me. No, Marcus Pettersson.
I'm being legit dead serious. I think he might be the best defenseman available at this deadline. And I think he's a good 3 or 4. Like he can maybe be a 2 on a cup contender, but I think in a perfect world, he's around like in that 3 range. But other than that, I don't really know how many other good
Ivan Provorov, maybe.
I don't know if Columbus is going to do that, though.
Yeah, I mean, he's expiring. He's expressed a willingness to stay. I know they drafted his brother. There's some conversation there about whether or not they're going to stay the course. But this is a weak trade deadline. Like if the Canucks decide they're going to try and do peer mediation and talk out their problems, who's the best player available? I mean,
hey man, don't disrespect Jim Rutherford like that. He loves talking about all the trades he wants to make and all that. I think they're going to deal one of them, Miller or Pettersson.
I still think, and I said this weeks ago to you when we were doing our show, I think you sit them down in a room and say, we're adults. You guys are figuring this out. You guys are both too good, and we're not blowing this up because you guys are immature. Like at a certain point, there needs to be an adult in the room who sits them down and says, you guys are figuring this out, because if you're both good, we can win the Stanley Cup.
Hey, I would agree with you. I just don't think Vancouver is going to do that. But going back to Toronto, like they're not going to have a choice. They are going to have to play Morgan Reilly 25, 26 minutes a night, because you're not going to find a defenseman that's better than him right around the trade deadline. You can maybe get a depth D to help out your defensive group, but you're not going to get someone who's better than Morgan Reilly. And of course, Nick, this might be the last big run for this core four. Marner, he's up after this year.
That's the best player who's available secretly. Mitch Marner is the best player that's available.
Hey, if they're talking about it, yes. And then they also have Zararis. He's up after this year. He's not going to get moved, by the way. But still, both of those guys, part of the core four, are up. This could be the last potential big run for that leadership group this year, and they got to make it count.
So we're going to throw it to the Locked On Leafs guys to talk about Morgan Reilly's game last night.
The bad, Dave. What sticks out to you as the bad?
The first goal that they allowed.
Riley's effort on that goal, man. Like that's tough. That's a tough look.
Between the Reilly giving up the puck below the goal line, Holmberg deciding I'm going to try to swipe at the puck rather than get the man that the puck is going to. The breakdown in coverage is terrible. Like, it was a colossal failure all around. But yeah, Morgan Reilly's got to be better there, man. Like, it's bad because he's feeling it. He's heard the noise. It's been constant about his play, and like Craig Berube said tonight, yeah, he's got to be better. But he's like, I'll give Berube credit. He's not putting it all on Reilly.
Right.
Like everything that's been going on, which that's what the coach is supposed to do. But yeah, no, like he needs to be better. Just everyone needs to be better on that play. Like that can't happen. That's their fourth
line. The fourth line.
Fourth line. You got your
works. Yeah.
So when we talk about this, and I think this is a good way to tie a bow on this, and I'm going to tie this to Evan Bouchard because as the Oilers host, I talk about this a lot. The offense first defenseman will always be maligned. The offense first defenseman who does a lot of the heavy lifting in all situations is always going to be critiqued for not being as well-rounded as they need to be, because those skill sets don't really overlap. You're not going to ask Evan Bouchard or Morgan Reilly to do what Jacob Slavin does. They fundamentally, the skill sets don't overlap. Those offense first guys typically aren't physical. They're not big and imposing where they can clear the net front, or they're going to be the best on puck retrievals. But that's the trade-off. There are very few guys who are good at both. In today's game, you would probably say the most well-rounded of those young defensemen is probably Charlie McAvoy, but I wouldn't feel great about saying that maybe it's Quinn Hughes as far as the most well-rounded of the offense and defense in their respective games. But when you get to that level that Reilly's at, and it sounds dumb to say, well, the Leafs kind of just got to suck it up because that's not what he's good at. But to some degree, you're asking him to do this. This is the role you have him in. And this is an imperfect roster, as we have a half decade of evidence to prove. And part of that is, these guys all have trade-offs. There is no perfectly well-rounded guy amongst them.
It's funny because I can kind of take this conversation into some of the Penguins defensemen as well, Nick. Some of the critiques of Erik Karlsson are just too much. Like, he's not good at defense. Everyone knows that. You are paying him for his offense. Like last night against Utah, for example, we'll get into more of the Penguin stuff in the final segment. Like, he was bad at times in his own zone, out to lunch with some of his awareness, but then he fires one heck of a shot to tie the game and then makes a play in overtime that was also just really sound. It's like players like that, they can have bad games, but they can turn around instantly because of the offensive talent that they have. And heck, people always used to have this same critique when Chris Letang was in his prime. Oh, he can't play defense. He doesn't do anything. They should trade him. And it's like, he's been such a rock for the Penguins. Yeah, he's definitely looking a little bit washed lately just because, he's old at this point and his defense has kind of deteriorated a little bit. But when he was in his prime, he was one of the top 10 best defensemen in the league. And I don't think that's people can argue against that. He was awesome, especially in that 2016 Stanley Cup run. I think there's going to be a time when he eventually gets into the Hall of Fame. I don't think it's going to be right away, but I think when people look at his Cup resume, I know he doesn't have the Norris, but I think the Hockey Hall of Fame is eventually going to put him in just because of his team success. But it was like that forever. Like, people will just be like, well, he doesn't play defense. But the thing with that is he could play defense, but you need to give him a little bit of help. That's why when he had a partner like Brian Dumoulin who could really help in that department, he can really play well in his own zone and let Chris Letang cook a little bit in the offensive zone. It's kind of the same thing with Erik Karlsson and Marcus Pettersson. It's why they've worked really well together these last couple of years. Karlsson, when he's at his best, he's doing the heavy lifting in the offensive zone, while Pettersson is doing the heavy lifting in his own zone because he's more defensively responsible. Like, that's his game. So I think a big part of it is, Nick, you need the right partner for those offensive defensemen that can really help out, especially when those players do make a mistake or two in their own zone.
And that's what worked really well for the Leafs when they first got McCabe from the Blackhawks. Was him and Morgan Reilly together were really strong. They worked really well together. Before that, before Jake Muzzin suffered the long-term injury that's basically knocked him out of hockey, him and Morgan Reilly were really good together in stretches. You need that shot-suppressing, good neutral zone defenseman to complement someone like Reilly, who is going to be adventurous and take risks. We're going to take our second and final break of today's show. When we come back, we'll talk a little bit about Hunter's Penguins, so be sure to stick around. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out with Hunter and I on this Thursday edition of Locked On NHL. And Hunter, I don't want to frame every single time we talk about the Penguins, Blue Jackets, Islanders, Rangers, Flyers, every team in the East other than Buffalo, around how bad the division, the conference is, and how any of these teams could make the playoffs with a good week. But it kind of feels like eventually some of these teams have to start dropping it like flies. I mean, the Rangers lost 2 in a row. The Islanders are on a nice mini run right now that the Rangers were on prior to the last 2 games they lost. It's anyone's ball game. I mean, I know the Penguins are purportedly willing to sell on pretty much anyone who's not one of their core 3 guys, but it feels like 1-2 good weeks gets the Penguins right back in the mix too.
Oh, no, 100%. I mean, heck, Nick, if they're able to win these next 4 games, that is a big if.
Yeah.
4 nations face off, they'll be 5 in a row heading into the break, and they'll be climbing up the standings a little bit. I don't think that's going to happen considering the level that I've seen them play at these last couple of weeks, but hey, anything's possible, right? But Sidney Crosby, man, vintage goal last night on Wednesday to win the Penguins that game and end the road trip on at least a little bit of a high note. The Penguins end their 7-game road trip with a 3-4 record. They lost 3 in a row prior to this win against Utah. They had lost to Anaheim, who stinks, Seattle, who also stinks, and they also lost to San Jose, who going into that game, the Sharks had lost 6 in a row in 9 of their last 10 games, and the Penguins put up a really sorry effort in that one. But Penguins were able to win that game because Sidney Crosby, once he goes to the backhand, Nick, it's over. Like, I even said to myself, when I saw him go to the backhand, I said, all right, that's over. And sure enough, puts the puck in the back of the net, has a really nice celebration. That's his 23rd career overtime winner, second most in NHL history behind Alex Ovechkin. Just a vintage goal. And I know this team is not very good, very well aware of that. But I'll never get tired of watching Sid do his thing, especially at age 37, man. The fact that he's still able to do things like this, he's different, man. I mean, he's going to go down as one of the 5 greatest players to ever play this game. And I just love that he continues to play at such a high level. He has a chance to really break that point per game record this year that he's been chasing down ever since he came into the league. So really great stuff from him. As for, what this means long-term, Kyle Dubas is still going to sell. I expect players like Marcus Pettersson, Matt Grzelcyk, Anthony Beauvillier, Drew O'Connor to probably be traded. I think they would sell high on someone like Raquel, though I think that's probably going to be in the summer. Same with Michael Bunting as well. If they can move one of their 2 older goalies like Jari Nedeljkovic, I'm sure they would try to do that because Yoel Blomqvist is ready for the NHLs. They have another kid in the AHL, Sergei Murashov, who's been lighting up the ECHL this year and the AHL, and I think his time is getting close as well. So a lot of decisions to be made, but I think this team is going to look quite a bit different in the next month.
So off of that, one thing I want to touch on, I forget what show I was listening to. They were talking about this, but they're the Penguins are very lucky that Sidney Crosby is the most team guy imaginable. And then B, it just sucks that he's kind of adrift these last few years on teams that aren't particularly competitive. they haven't won a playoff series in forever. I mean, since what, 2018 when they lost to the Capitals in the second round? It's been a long time. And look, they probably should have beaten the Rangers in 22 in that first round series. I would say the Penguins were the better team. They were a better
team against the Islanders the year before. They outplayed them that entire series, and they got screwed over because Jari stunk in games 5 and game 6.
Yeah, I mean, they've had chances, and very similar to the conversation we've had about the Rangers to some degree. At a certain point, if you realize that something's not working, you got to reassess. And for the Penguins, that's especially challenging because you're not going to break up Sid, Malkin, and Letang. And the Karlsson trade for what they gave up, you do that every time. You know, they didn't give up anything of consequence. The issue has been the supporting cast. You know, they paid Jari, they paid Ryan Graves, they spent money on average to below average depth players, and they haven't really been able to find the right supporting cast. You know, it's crazy to me they had to trade away Jake Gensel, someone who I thought would be a Penguin lifer. It sucks that they're going to have to kind of disassemble this group piece by piece until the big three hang it up.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, and this goes back, it's not even just, Kyle Dubas.
No, it goes way before that.
This goes back to late stage Jim Rutherford, where he was just making moves on a whim.
Trading Alexiak for a 4th round pick and then trading him to get the same 4th round pick back.
But he traded him because he lost a fight to Tom Wilson.
Yeah.
I'm dead serious. Like, he was that mad at Tom Wilson for something that happened a little bit before that, challenges him to a fight, and then Wilson just knocks Alexiak out. And Jim was like, oh, I'm just going to trade you back. Like, I'm not going to deal with that. And again, like the depth issues and the other issues, like this goes back to late stage Rutherford. Like, he wasn't that good at the end. Yeah, like some of those teams were deep, but they also were still flawed. Like, they could have gone a bit further in playoffs, win a round or two. I don't think they were going to win Stanley Cup or anything, but those were still at least, okay teams. You then have Ron Hextall comes in. He doesn't really do much for the depth. Kyle Dubas, his first offseason, especially July 1, was not very good, gave out way too much money, way too much term to players that are average to below average. And you can see right now, they're paying the price. Ryan Graves has been a healthy scratch for a lot of games this season. Tristan Jarry is in Wilkes-Barre for God knows how much longer, considering that contract has been bad. You signed Noah Chari, who's not really doing much. Matt Nieto. Since then, I will give him credit. His moves since that July 1 have been better. The Karlsson trade, even this last offseason, getting Kevin Hayes, for example, Cody Glassfeld, Tomasino's been really good. Like, his moves geared toward the future have actually been fairly solid. His trades, I think, as a whole, have mostly been good. The Gensel trade is actually working out really well for them right now. It's just some of his win now moves and some of the evals that he had to start his tenure weren't very good. And, I'll be curious to see if that changes during this offseason here, because the Penguins both have a lot of money to spend. I mean, they're going to have about $22 million in cap space right now. It's probably going to be more as the cap goes up even more this offseason. So they'll have a decision to make. Do they want to try and potentially make the playoffs one more time before Crosby retires? Or, and I've been talking about this on my show this week, do they want to accidentally try to tank for Gavin McKenna and really set themselves up for a long time? And I know that's going to piss off the rest of the NHL, considering they tanked for Crosby and got him and Malkin and all that.
That was 20 years ago. I feel like if you break it up over 20 years, you're allowed to pick first overall again. I think people start to complain when you do what the Oilers did, or, like the Blackhawks, where you picked in the top 5, like 3 or 4 years in a row. That's where people start to get pissed off. And it's especially funny because the teams that do that take like twice as long to get better when they tank for that long. So it's a real conundrum, There's a world where next year is kind of the victory lap, where every team gives Sid the gift on the way out. He gets to captain Canada one last time. And then when the season's over, that's it. And he goes off to do whatever he wants to do after. And
he does have 2 more years left on his contract. So it's probably the year after.
Yeah, the year after that. But I know the Canada stuff will be exciting. And it sucks for Penguins fans that like the highlight of your season is like he gets to captain the international team for like 2 weeks. But it'll be cool to see. I know you and I have talked about that off the show. Just it'll be cool for the guys like McDavid and McKinnon who grew up idolizing this guy to get to play with him representing the Leaf. It'll be cool to see.
Yeah, I can't wait for the Four Nations face-off in a couple weeks as well. Just want to end the show. Miro Heiskanen of the Dallas Stars just announced his week to week. Doesn't look like he's going to be able to play, Nick, which really sucks because that injury was really unfortunate with Mark Stone. Just didn't like that. So just sucks that he's not going to be able to play, but I'm still really excited for Best on Best Hockey. It's been a long time since we've gotten it, and I know this is an ad toward the Olympics next year. I'm still going to have fun watching
It's
this.
better than an all-star game no one cares about. That's the way
Yes.
I'm looking at this. Like, is it perfect? No. Would I like there to be a Team Europe? So like guys like Draisaitl, Stützle, Roman Josi, Nico Hischier could be featured? Of course. I would love to have seen that. I would have liked to have seen them do something similar to Team North America. If we couldn't invite Russia and we wanted to do a team of all the under 22s, you know, if you wanted to put Celebrini and Bedard on the same team, that would have been awfully cool as well. You know, I'm looking forward to this. I will almost certainly be stupidly giving Fanatics $230 of my money for someone on Team USA. I haven't decided who I'm going to get yet. Probably Quinn Hughes or Matthew Tkachuk, but when you get these opportunities, you got to take them. But that'll do it for today's edition of Locked On NHL. We will talk to you guys next week. Everyone enjoy the hockey.